She stood on the side of the road, shivering from the cold and pain, watching as their car disappeared into the distance. The home that once was her world would never return. Abandoned, thrown away, she was left all alone. But in that moment, a spark ignited in her heart. What would happen next? Someone entered her life, and this step could change everything. But could she trust again? The wind howled, filling the air with deep, prolonged sounds that made it even colder. The rain, mixed with snow, relentlessly battered the ground, turning it into thick mud that instantly stuck to her paws, creeping through her fur and causing painful stabs in the pads. Lexa lay under the crooked wooden fence, curled into a tight ball, desperately trying to shield herself from the icy storm. She was alone, and the world around her seemed endlessly empty. Her fur, once thick and shiny, was now dirty, matted in clumps, covered in lumps of dried mud, with no trace of the beauty it once had. She was no longer the good girl. Her body and soul were wounded. Every breath came with difficulty. Her lungs felt as if they were being squeezed by the dampness, by the cold that penetrated deep inside. She could barely open her eyes, trying to see anything in the dark, but all she saw were dark shapes and endless rain. Lexa tried to move, but her paws refused to obey her, as though her body had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Every movement, every effort made her feel the strength leaving her, and she became more and more alien to this world. Her body ached. Pain was everywhere. It wasn't just physical suffering. Hunger, fatigue, cold, and loneliness seeped into every cell of her being. The pain never released her. It became a part of her, like an old, dark memory piercing every moment. Lexa couldn't remember the last time she felt warmth, when she wasn't afraid of hunger, when people didn't ignore her. Everything was mixed into an endless stream of fear and loneliness. Once, everything was different. Once, she had a home. Once, she was a happy dog, joyfully running around the yard, playing with the children. Her owners would lovingly call her good girl, petting her on the head, and in those simple gestures was more warmth than Lexa could ever understand. She knew her place was here, in the house, with her family. She was loyal, devoted, and felt needed. Every day was filled with meaning. But one day, everything changed. Everything became cold. At first, her owners began to come home less often. Their gazes became such that Lexa began to feel something was wrong. Sometimes they would just pass by, ignoring her. And then one day, she stood by the door, waiting for it to open, for them to call her back inside, but it didn't happen. The door remained closed. She stood there listening to their footsteps, hearing them talk to each other. But there were no warm words, no loving calls like there used to be. She waited. Waiting became her life. Time passed slowly, but Lexa didn't back down. It didn't fit in her head that they could forget her. She was ready to wait because she believed they were just busy, that they would return like before. Days turned into weeks, but her owners didn't return. The bowl remained empty, and the cold kennel was her only shelter. But despite everything, Lexa continued to stand by the door, not understanding what was happening. Gradually, she began to realize the terrible truth. One day, when her owners finally came, instead of opening the door and calling her back inside, they silently approached, grabbed the leash, and led her outside. She looked into their eyes, trying to find even a hint of love, but all she saw was emptiness. With that look, she was no longer their dog. There was no attachment, no affection, no warmth in their eyes that she so desperately searched for. All of it disappeared as if she had never been a part of their lives. With every step they took, Lexa felt her world crumbling. She couldn't believe that she was no longer awaited, that she was no longer needed. When they led her out of the house, she felt her heart constrict, and with each passing moment, her world became emptier and emptier. No one said goodbye. They simply led her to the car. Lexa couldn't understand what was happening. She didn't know why they had taken her, unaware that this would be her final journey with them. The car started moving, but a storm was raging in her chest. After a few minutes, they stopped, and there she was, standing, looking at the empty road. Her owners unloaded her and the car disappeared without a glance back. Lexa stood at the side of the road, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The wind pierced her to the bone, and the cold seemed unbearable. She stood still, stunned, not knowing what to do. The world suddenly felt alien, and there was not a familiar face on the street, no salvation. Lexa's gaze was empty, her soul full of void. Her heart couldn't take it, and tears welled up in her eyes that she could no longer hold back. She had been thrown away. But how was that possible? How could those who once called her their own do this to her? She took a step, then another, and with each step she moved forward, not knowing where to go. There was cold in her chest and only fog in her mind. She walked down the road, barely understanding where she was. Cars passed by, people didn't notice her, and her existence became invisible to them. But Lexa kept going because she didn't know what else to do. Every movement was an effort, but she didn't give up. A weak spark of hope still remained in her heart that maybe, somewhere, there was a place where she could find love and loyalty again. But this journey was long and difficult, and Lexa knew that ahead of her lay only cold, loneliness, and suffering. Lexa wandered through the frozen streets of the city, unsure of where to go. Every movement was a struggle. The snow burned her paws, and a cut on her right paw pad bled, leaving behind crimson marks that quickly soaked into the cold earth. The pain wouldn't let go, but Lexa had long since grown accustomed to it. It had become part of her life, as inseparable as the cold or hunger. She walked, barely understanding how she could still move, but each step was necessary, a step toward survival. The world around her was empty and lifeless. The houses stood like abandoned monuments, but their windows were dark, and the doors were closed, as if the city had forgotten her. She searched for shelter, but there was nothing to offer warmth. At some point, she noticed an old bus stop on the empty street. She entered under the awning, pressing against the cold walls, trying to shield herself from the relentless wind. It was a little better here. The wind didn't howl through the walls as much, and although the cold still cut through her to the bone, at least here she wasn't exposed. But at that moment, the night brought a new threat. Lexa, dozing, head hanging low, barely felt her body begin to ache from the long time spent in one position. Suddenly, a sound woke her, a rasping, wild bark that echoed in the silent night. Lexa lifted her head, and immediately her heart began to beat faster. In the shadow on the far side of the bus stop appeared two thin, stray dogs. Their eyes were filled with fierce hunger, burning with the desire to attack. Their fur was dirty and matted, their bodies shriveled and gaunt, evidence of days without food. Lexa felt her body freeze with weakness. She could barely stand, exhaustion literally chaining her to the ground, and there was no strength left for a quick reaction. But the instinct to survive screamed inside her, "Run!" However, her legs wouldn't obey. She trembled from pain, fatigue, and fear, unsure how to handle it. She was vulnerable, exhausted, and had no one to rely on. All that remained was her own determination. The dogs drew closer, their growling growing louder, their eyes boring into her like sharp knives. Lexa stood still, motionless, trying to guess what would happen next. She knew she couldn't fight them. They were stronger and faster than she was. But her instinct wouldn't allow her to give up. She stood, ready to fight to the last. The silence rang in her ears and her heart pounded like a wild animal's. At that moment, the dogs took their final step, and Lexa could almost feel their breath when suddenly a loud crash broke the stillness. It was a can, accidentally falling from a trash can on the street. The sharp sound drew the dogs' attention. Yelping, they turned their heads, stumbling off course and becoming alert. Lexa didn't know exactly what happened, but she took advantage of the moment. The dogs, unwilling to risk it, quickly moved aside, growling at her one last time but not making any further moves. Lexa stood, unable to believe she had survived this. She couldn't move, her paws literally refusing to obey. She stood there, trembling, her body in shock from what had just happened. The wind continued to drive the rain, and the night consumed everything around. Lexa returned to her shelter, but a void remained in her chest. She had survived another night, but was it worth it? Lexa didn't know, and all she could do was stay alive, each step bringing her closer to that part of herself that, deep inside, still believed the world could get better. But tonight was too cold, too dark, to hope for anything more. A man in a long coat with a hood stood nearby, watching her. Lexa tensed, her instincts awakening, ready to flee. He was a stranger, and she couldn't allow herself to relax. Too much pain and betrayal filled her past for her to trust so easily. She could leave, disappear into the shadows, but something held her in place. The man didn't move, staying in the shadows as if waiting for her reaction. The silence around her was suffocating, and suddenly, to her surprise, he slowly crouched down, not taking his eyes off her, and then extended his hand. In his palm was a piece of bread, old and moldy, but to her it was everything. Hunger tormented her day and night, torturing her body. She couldn't understand what he wanted, but the smell of food filled her nose, and that was enough to make her step forward. Lexa froze, her heart pounding, every nerve in her body tense. She couldn't believe this wasn't a trap, that this man wouldn't bring her more pain. Watching his hand, she slowly approached, cautiously watching his every movement. His gaze was gentle, but she couldn't trust him. He was a stranger, and her past whispered to her that trust was a dangerous thing. Her paws trembled, but she couldn't resist approaching. Hunger was stronger than fear. She carefully sniffed the piece of bread, not lifting her head, barely glancing at the man, and snatched it, immediately jumping away. He didn't try to come closer. He stayed where he was, calmly watching her. No pressure, no aggression, just an empty space between them. The moment stretched on. Lexa remained wary, but feeling the food in her stomach, she began to calm down, though every movement was cautious. The man stayed where he was, observing her, not trying to intervene, giving her time. The next morning, he came again. Every day, he brought a little food. Lexa felt her fear gradually starting to dissolve. Each visit was like a small miracle. He simply sat and stayed silent, never reaching out, never trying to get too close. It was all she could accept. He asked for nothing in return, he was just there. And slowly, Lexa began to get used to his presence, to his silent support. He became her only hope in this cold and cruel world. Sometimes she couldn't believe it wasn't a dream. A stranger was showing her kindness without expecting anything in return. He was gentle, but that was enough for Lexa to begin opening up. In his presence, she felt her anxiety slowly ebbing away, though not entirely. She still couldn't trust fully. But one day he didn't come. Lexa felt an unease she couldn't explain. It was a strange feeling, an anxiety that rose from her chest and wouldn't let go. She sat at her temporary shelter, staring into the emptiness. feeling the loneliness slowly fill her again, like a dark shadow blocking the light. The next day was the same. He didn't show up again. Lexa felt a strange solitude, foreign to her in the past few weeks. With each passing hour, her waiting grew more anxious. Her heart clenched in pain. Had she really been left alone again? Had that little spark of hope gone out? And then, on the third day, she saw him. The figure of the man appeared in the distance in her line of sight. He walked down the street, trudging through the snow and dirt, but in his hand, as always, was food. Lexa couldn't hold back her impulse. She took a step toward him, not thinking about how she looked or the feelings she was experiencing. She just moved forward, and step by step, it was as if an invisible force was guiding her. She couldn't stop. This moment was important. It didn't matter what would happen next. The only thing that mattered was that she had finally decided to take a chance. When she got closer, their eyes met. The man stopped, and Lexa felt something stir inside her chest. It was a moment when she decided to give him a chance. The man took Lexa to his home, where she was greeted by a warm room filled with comfort and silence. A bowl of water sat in the corner, and a soft bed waited to receive her weary body. Lexa carefully stepped inside, her paws moving slowly over the warm rug, her eyes reflecting a mixture of distrust and confusion. Her instincts couldn't yet believe this place was safe, that she wouldn't be left on the street again, abandoned to fate. She sat quietly in the corner for a long time, watching the man's every move warily. He spoke to her in a soft voice, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every suspicious sound made her flinch. Her ears perked up, and her heart beat faster, as if expecting an unpleasant turn of events. But days went by, and everything remained calm. He didn't hurt her. He didn't force her to do anything she didn't want to. All he did was feed her, give her space, and never pressured her. Weeks passed, then months, and Lexa began to adjust. Gradually, she realized that this man wouldn't hurt her. He was kind, and his attention wasn't motivated by need or cruelty. He simply cared for her. She could sleep soundly at night, no longer afraid that she'd wake up in the cold, dark, lonely world. One day, he placed his hand on her head. Lexa froze. It was so unexpected that, for a moment, she couldn't understand what was happening. But then she felt the warmth of his palm, the softness that carried no threat. His touch was sincere, gentle, and there was no cruelty in it. Tears, like cold drops, rolled down her face. These were tears of release, tears she couldn't hold back because, for the first time in a long while, she felt not pain, but something like hope. With each passing day, Lexa grew more confident. She learned to trust the man, no longer afraid. He became her support, her protector. Sometimes she played with toys, lifting her paws into the air, watching them with curiosity, as if discovering a new world. The joy of chasing a ball returned to her, like something she had long forgotten. But despite this, there was always a shadow of the past in her eyes, the days when her life was full of pain and fear. Every night she sat by the door, as if expecting to be cast back into the cold world, into the emptiness where no kind person existed. She gazed into the darkness, reflecting on her journey. Her new home was full of warmth, but the memories of being abandoned didn't fade. She couldn't erase them from her mind, but despite these shadows, Lexa began to live again. She learned to love again, to rejoice in the simple things. Her old life, filled with pain and loneliness, felt like a dark dream she had awakened from into this new, warm world. Now she had a home, and there was no pain or fear, but her past remained with her. It hadn't disappeared, and it never could, but it had become part of her strength. Lexa understood that no matter how cruel her path had been, she had still found a new way, a new life. The man who saved her knew this. He knew that Lexa was more than just a dog. She was a symbol of how even the most broken hearts can find love, find a home, and find peace. She proved that even in the darkest places, light can be found.